Brooklyn, the most populous of New York's 5 boroughs. The city began as the Dutch village of Brooklyn on the East River shore of Long Island during the 17th century. It remained autonomous until 1898, when it was incorporated into the city of New York. Brooklyn, whose neighborhoods still retain the characteristics of the national groups that have called the borough home for decades. It was into this world that Alphonse Gabriele Capone was born.
Hello, I'm Eddie Portuguese. This is the Navy Yard section of Brooklyn. I'm in Commodore Barry Park. A tenement once stood here at 95 Navy Street. This is where Al Capone entered the world on January 17th, 1899.
The man who would come to be known as Public Enemy No. 1 was the fourth of 9 children born to Gabriele and Teresina Capone, immigrants from southern Italy. They had arrived in America in 1893.
This is St. Michael's and St. Edward's Church, where Al Capone was baptized on February 7th, 1899. Sophia Milo, a family friend, was the godmother. Strangely, there's no record of a godfather.
Brooklyn was then a thriving port. Industry boomed, fueled by the constant influx of cheap immigrant labor.
Sometime between 1907 and 1910, Gabriel moved his family here, to 38 Garfield Place, in what is now the Park Slope neighborhood. A pool hall down the street became a favorite hangout of the father and his son. Young Al started attending school at the age of 5, first at PS 7, and later here at PS 133 on Baltic Street. However, after a violent altercation with his female teacher and receiving a beating from the principal, Capone quit school at the age of 14.
It was around this time that Capone came under the influence of Johnny Torrio, a local crime boss. Torrio had immigrated to the U.S. from southern Italy when he was a small child. Although diminutive in stature, he was smart, preferring diplomacy over violence, and represented a new breed of organized criminal.
I'm standing on the corner of 4th Avenue and Union Street, where Johnny Torrio had his office and social club. Baltic Street is behind me. And down this way is Garfield Place. Before dropping out of school, Al Capone would pass by this corner at least twice a day. It's easy to see how he and Torrio crossed paths.
No longer a student, Capone went to work first in a munitions factory, then as a pin setter in a bowling alley, and later as a cloth cutter in a book bindery.
In 1917, Torrio introduced Capone to the Italian gangster Francesco Yaioli, otherwise known to the world as Frankie Yale. Yale hired Capone to be a bouncer and a bartender at his club, the Harvard Inn, right here in Coney Island.
One night, while working at the Harvard Inn, Capone made a lewd comment about a man's sister. The man, Frank Galluccio, responded to this offense by slashing the left side of Capone's face with a knife. This incident gave rise to his nickname, Scarface, which Capone detested.
This is Sand Street. 100 years ago, this street was lined with brothels and saloons. Capone was known to frequent these establishments. It was probably here where he contracted syphilis while still a teenager. I spoke with a Dr. Brent Wieland, an infectious disease specialist, to get a better understanding of syphilis and its effects on the brain. What effects does the disease have on the brain?
So the effects of syphilis on the brain are many and quite varied. In the early stages of disease, the effects can be similar to bacterial meningitis or a viral meningitis, which includes headaches, neck stiffness, fevers, and it can also progress to cause nerve palsies or paralysis of some of the cranial nerves in the face. It can also cause what's called neurovascular syphilis, which is inflammation of the blood vessels in the brain. And that can lead to basically strokes or other symptoms of lack of blood flow to the brain. In the later stages of disease, it can cause general paresis, which was previously called general paralysis of the insane. And that is a progressive dementia, which is universally fatal.
Now, some people have suggested that Al Capone's volatile temper and willingness to take risks were the results of syphilis acting on his brain. Do you find this theory plausible?
I find it to be unlikely that syphilis was the cause of his erratic personality. And the reason for that is because the typical progression of syphilis, once it manifests with neurological symptoms, is a relatively rapid decline. And in fact, it generally progresses to death in an average of 2.5 years after the beginning of symptoms. And my understanding with Al Capone is that his was actually a much more gradual decline during his time in prison, but his symptoms really began while he was incarcerated.
Living in Park Slope gave Capone the chance to mix with a more affluent and diverse crowd. He met his future wife, Mary Josephine Coughlin, at a club on Carroll Street. She was the daughter of Irish immigrants and 2 years his senior. The couple were married here, at the Star of the Sea Church, on December 30th, 1918.